This is the International Soccer Preview, and we are Soccerphiles Canada. Welcome to Series 17. We're looking at the squads of the 2023 Gold Cup. This is the full-length version for Cuba's players. Here we go. Hello and welcome to the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada. I'm Kevin, and this is Series 17 on the players of the 2023 Gold Cup. This episode covers Cuba's players. Just a couple of notes before we begin. This media cast is in two parts. The first is an overview of the candidates for the squad and our guess as to their likelihood of making it. So we compiled a list basically of players who have been called up to the squad since the beginning of 2022, and we organized them according to their likelihood. In the second part of the media cast here, we're going to go over that list we made in terms of who made it to the squad. So by that time, we'll have the preliminary roster and the final roster, and we can let you know who among the candidates did make the team and maybe how accurate our predictions were. Now, we did do those in two separate shows for previous player podcasts during the World Cup and the final round of World Cup qualifying for CONCACAF. But this time we're combining them into one. It's also the first time that we've done Cuba's players because they did not reach either of those levels. So first time going through Cuba. Okay, and we are organizing our discussion here by position of the players. So we realize that this sometimes is not always accurate because players do move around, but that is probably the best way for us to proceed. So let's begin, and we have been beginning with a look at the team's recent games and their lineups. We don't really see much point in doing that for Cuba. We have done a team podcast on Cuba before. Rather than that, we're going to talk a little bit about the immigration issue in 2019 and in many Gold Cups before. There have been defections from the team. It's a problem in baseball particularly. And I wonder if there's been a change, because now we do see that or we will see that a lot of these players are playing for teams in Guatemala or in Costa Rica. So I'm not sure. I tried to do some research on it. I even had a student who I taught in an English night class, actually, who was Cuban. He was a man in his 40s who was an engineer back in Cuba, but it had in fact defected to Canada, and I tried to understand the situation through him. I guess this would have been around 2020 or so, 2019 perhaps, and sometimes he seemed worried about it. He had family back in Cuba and was worried about retribution for his family, and other times he didn't. And I had several conversations with it or about it with him, and never really got a sense of what the situation was, if how illegal defection was. So sometimes it seemed to be that they could leave the country, and at other times they couldn't. I know he himself had defected and was hoping to get his family over to Canada, but I never really got to the bottom of what the rules were. So we do have some Cuban players you will see through here that are playing in countries around Cuba, like Costa Rica or Guatemala. So obviously they're allowed to leave because they are playing for the Cuban team. And I don't think we'll have a situation like the 5 defections we had in the 2019 Gold Cup. Of course, Cuba didn't make it to the 2021 Gold Cup, so we didn't get kind of a sense of it there. And we will see during this Gold Cup whether they will have similar problems, or if there's a rule change that will make that not be a problem. It's particularly a problem in baseball, of course, for Cuba. Okay, let's move on directly then to the squad, and we look at candidates I see I already have the manager's name there, but actually we'll begin with the manager in 2019 for the Gold Cup then, and that is Raul Medeiros, and he managed until the end of the Gold Cup there, and then Pablo Elior Sanchez took over. They didn't make it to the 2021 Gold Cup, so this will be his first tournament, and he managed a club in Cuba, Pinar del Rio, from 2013 to 2018. I think that was his only managerial position other than the national team here. Okay, well, with goalkeepers, we have a definite candidate in Sandy Sanchez. Sandy Sanchez has been with Cuba since 2015, and he has 28 caps and 1 goal. He has a goal. His goal was scored against Bermuda in a friendly in January 2019. He's 29 years old and he plays in the Dominican Republic. So there we see that players are able to leave Cuba. He left Cuba in 2018 and played for a different team in the Dominican Republic as well as for a couple of teams in Brazil. He was on the squad for the 2015 Gold Cup as a bench, as a backup keeper, and then was a starter in 2019, Sandy Sanchez. And since the start of 2022, which is the time from which we're measuring their recent participation, he has started 5 of their 9 games and was on the bench for 4 others. So Sandy Sanchez, a definite candidate here, but not necessarily the starter. And we're not really kind of trying to predict who the starters are going to be. But if there is a different starter than Sandy Sanchez, it'll be one of the 2 likely candidates, either Nelson Johnson or Reiko Arozarena. So we'll introduce Nelson Johnson. He has 14 caps for the national team since 2018, and he's 33 years old, so quite a bit older than even Sandy Sanchez. And he plays in Costa Rica for Jicaral in Costa Rica, leaving Cuba to play in Honduras in 2021. He was on the preliminary squad for the 2015 Gold Cup and a backup keeper for the 2019 Gold Cup. And he started 2 of their 9 games since the start of 2022, but was on the bench for 6 others, only 1 match that he wasn't selected for. So he looks very much a likely candidate, Nelson Johnson. And the final likely candidate is Reiko Arozarena. So he has been with Cuba just since 2022 and is 26 years old. And he's playing in the USA with Tampa Bay Rowdies. He was with a couple of teams in Mexico until 2018 when he left Cuba. Or left his club, Pinar del Rio in Cuba. And he got his first cap in November 2022 and started 2 of their 3 remaining games up until May 2023. That's now. That's the time we're kind of ending the session at. He was on the bench for 1 other. Yeah, so we don't know what the June games will bring, but up until the end of May, he started 2 of their 3 games. So in a way, he seems a bit more likely than Nelson Johnson. Looks to be the kind of the second keeper there. So we'll just put him ahead of Nelson Johnson here. And finally, our final candidate is Elior Pozo. And we have him as a possible but unlikely candidate. So he's been with Cuba since 2015, and he is 27 years old, 28 years old perhaps. And he just moved back to Cuba to play for Pinar del Rio for the 3rd time, but he was with Navegantes in Brazil. Actually, there was another player, maybe 2 others who played for that team. Actually, Sandy Sanchez was one of them, and he moved. He was with Pinar del Rio in Cuba for the second time from 2018 to 2021. So I'm kind of thinking there was a rule change about playing in different countries around 2021. He was selected for the preliminary squad, earlier poser, for the 2015 Gold Cup and was a backup keeper for the 2019 Gold Cup. But he last appeared for the national team on the bench in June 2022. So he was around after the COVID period and after the 2021 Gold Cup, but it's been a year since he's been on the team. So it looks pretty set unless they bring someone in new there. Sandy Sanchez, Reiko Arozarena, and Nelson Johnson look like they're going to be the three keepers. Let's move on to defenders. And we begin with central defenders, and we have a definite candidate in Carlos Vasquez. So Carlos Vasquez has been with Cuba since 2021, and he is 24 years old, and he has 14 caps and 0 goals. He plays in Austria for a small team in Austria called Dornbirn, and he was with 2 teams in Spain prior to that. And his nickname actually is Cavafe, I believe you pronounce it, and he often goes by that name. He hasn't been involved in any cups, having joined the team in 2021, but he has started all 9 of their games since the beginning of 2022. So the 24-year-old Carlos Vasquez, or Cavafe, a definite candidate for us. A likely candidate is Yosel Piedra. Yosel Piedra has been with Cuba since 2015 and is 29 years old with 34 caps and 1 goal. And he plays for San Carlos in Costa Rica. And he was in Guatemala before that, and Villa Clara in Cuba since 2018. We'll keep an eye on these dates to maybe get a sense of if we can sense if there was a rule change. Maybe 2018 was the year. Yosel Piedra was a starter in the 2019 Gold Cup. And since the beginning of 2022, he has started 3 of their 9 games, subbed in for 2 and on the bench for 1. So just 3 games that he was not selected for. So we consider Yosel Piedra a likely candidate. And then we have 3 possible candidates. The first one is Eduardo Hernandez. Eduardo Hernandez is brand new to the team since 2023, just 1 cap for the 20-year-old, and he is in Cuba with Santiago de Cuba. And his first and only appearance was a start in their last of 9 games to May 2023. So just showing up right at the end here. We'll see if he plays any of their friendlies in June. But Eduardo Hernandez, because of that appearance, becomes a possible candidate. Next is Modesto Mendez. Modesto Mendez has been with Cuba since 2021 and has 7 caps and is 25 years old. And he is playing for Inter Miami's B team, or Inter Miami 2 in the USA. In fact, he was loaned to Charleston Battery for a while, but he's been with them for a few years, just loaned out in 2021 and moved from Pinar del Rio in Cuba in 2020. So he got his first appearance in August 2021, and since the beginning of 2022 started 3 of their 9 games, but wasn't selected for 6 others. So in the picture, but not selected that often. Finally, we have Mario Penalver. Mario Penalver, also new to the team since 2023, and the 20-year-old has 3 caps. He was with Mixco in Guatemala, having moved from Matanzas in Cuba in 2022. However, his contract ended with Mixco, so he's looking for a new team from July of 2023. So perhaps if he gets field time in this tournament, that will be a good showcase for him. So he got his first cap in November 2022 and didn't start any of the remaining 3 games, but was subbed in for all 3 of those matches. So Mario Penalver, our third possible candidate, and that's all that we have for the central defense position. I think I've not put it in the right place in the graphics there. And we move on to the left back position, where we have a definite candidate in Daniel Morejon. Daniel Morejon. Sorry, not Daniel, Dariel. And he has been with Cuba since 2018. And he has 29 caps, but is just 24 years old. And he is still in Cuba, has played all of his career in Cuba with Villa Clara. And he was part of the Gold Cup squad in 2019, where he was a starter. Started all 3 games there, and started all 9 of their games since the beginning of the of 2022. So a definite candidate, and I should learn to pronounce his name better. Maybe I'll do better in the second half. Dario Morejon, and I'm sorry, Dario, for butchering it so badly. Okay, we also have a possible candidate in more of a veteran, Jorge Luis Corrales. So we only have him at the possible level, though. And Jorge Luis Corrales has been with Cuba since 2011 with 42 caps and 1 goal. He's 32 years old, and he plays for FC Tulsa in the USA. He's been with several teams in North America after moving from Cuba in 2015. So that confuses me even more as to what the rules are. He was a starter in the 2013 Gold Cup and the 2015 Gold Cup, but wasn't part of the Gold Cup in 2019. Well, this is interesting. He wasn't allowed to be part of the Gold Cup in 2019 because he had moved to the USA. I don't have word that he defected. So just moved to the USA. And that's what I mean by some confusion here, because some players just kind of move, some of them defect, and some of them live in Cuba but play in, are still with Cuba but play for teams outside the country. Anyway, he was off the team then for 5.5 years, and Jorge Luis Corrales returned in 2021, and since the beginning of 2022 has started 4 of their 9 games, and he was injured for 1 and not selected for 4 others. So back on the Cuban team, having not been allowed to play in the 2019 Gold Cup or for Cuba for those 5.5 years, and he is back. So he is a possible candidate. For right backs, we only have 1 candidate, and it is at the likely level. It is Gribel Palma. And Gribel Palma has been with Cuba since his first cap in November 2022, and then he started all 3 of their remaining games to 2023. So brand new to the team and very young at 20 years old, and plays for Ciego de Avila in Cuba. So a likely candidate, even though he's very young. And then we have 1 player coded as kind of a general defender. That means we don't really know enough about him to know what position he's in. But actually, we have coded him as seemingly off the squad, or assessed him as seemingly off the squad. He got his first cap in November 2021, and then last appeared on the bench in June of 2022. So he's also a very young player and may come back into the picture, but he has been out of the picture for a year. All right, moving on to midfielders, we have a definite candidate for defensive midfielder in Carol Espino. So Carol Espino has been with Cuba since 2019 and has 24 caps and 1 goal, even though he's just 21 years old. So really an early start with the team there. And he plays for Comunicaciones in Guatemala. He left Cuba in 2021, or he left his Cuban team in 2021. And he was part of the Gold Cup, starting all 3 games in 2019, except Game 3. He was a sub in Game 3. And since the beginning of 2022, he has started 8 of their 9 games, not selected for 1 game there. So Carol Espino, a definite candidate. At the possible level, we have Nasser Sando. So Nasser Sando has been with Cuba since 2018 and has 9 caps and is 24 years old. And he is still playing in Cuba with Cienfuegos. That's his second spell with them. I wish more players would play for Cienfuegos because it's such a fun name to say. Nasser Sando returned after a 4-year absence in March 2023 and subbed in both of their last 2 games to that point. So when they make kind of a sudden return, or when they're part of the last few games, it's always difficult to know. We often put them at the possible category, which is what we've done with Nasser Sando. And finally, we have a player who seems to be off the team, David Inserti. So David Inserti actually just was with the team since 2021. He's very young, 21 years old, with 7 caps, and he plays in Italy, Olbia in Italy, not a team I'm familiar with, and Ternana before that. I have heard of that team. He got his first appearance in June of 2021, but last appeared for the national team in June of 2022. So perhaps a name we'll hear from in the future, David Inserti. Moving on to central midfielders. Once again, I've messed up my graphic by putting things in the wrong place. We're moving on from central defenders, from defensive midfielders on to central midfielders. But we only have 1 candidate as a central midfielder, and that is Denilson Milanes, and we have him as a likely candidate. Denilson Milanes has been with Cuba since 2022, and he has just 2 caps and a lot of 2s involved with Milanes. He was born in 2002, and he moved to Carmelita in Costa Rica in 2022. He was with another team in Costa Rica before that. Okay, enough with the 2s. He is 20 years old then, and got his first cap in March 2022. Guess we're not done with the 2s. And he started none of their remaining games up until May 2023, but was subbed in for 5 and not selected for 4. Well, that seems a bit generous to put him as a likely candidate. I think we'll move him down there to possible. A possible candidate, Denilson Milanes. All right. Wow. Just 1 central midfielder. That's very thin. And we are finding a couple of the teams quite thin here. Guatemala thin in the midfield as well. But they do have some left and right midfielders who may play out of position moving into the center. And the first one is Junior Perez, who we have as a definite candidate. So Junior Perez, just with the team since 2021, and just 22 years old, but he's already got 13 caps, and he also plays in Guatemala. He moved from Guantanamo in Cuba in 2022, and he is currently not connected with the team from July 2023 2023, I guess his contract ran out. So he too may be looking for some exposure during this cup to attract a new team. He started five of their 9 games since the start of 2022, and he was subbed in for 3. So just one game that he wasn't selected for. So we have Junior Perez as a definite candidate. As a possible candidate, we have Roberni Caballero. So Roberni Caballero has been with Cuba since 2016, and he has 15 caps and 3 goals, is 27 years old. And kind of the inverse of Junior Perez, rather than looking for a team, he has just moved to one. The contract beginning in July 2023, that's Jalapa in Guatemala. So he moves there from Villa Clara in Cuba in 2023. And he did play in the 2019 Gold Cup. He didn't appear in game 1, but got a starting position for the following 2 games. But then he was off the team for 3.5 years, returning in November of 2022, and didn't start any of their remaining 3 games, but was subbed in for 1 and on the bench for 2 others. So another player kind of making a bit of a comeback here at the very end, and we put him as a possible candidate. That's Roberni Caballero. And we have one possible but unlikely candidate in Kevin Martin. Kevin Martin also joining a new team. He's joining Lorca in Spain from July 2023, moving there from Santos to Guapil in Costa Rica, actually, their B team. And Kevin Martin is 19 years old, so very young. No caps for Cuba, but he got his first appearance on the bench in 2022. However, he was not selected for either of the 2 remaining games after that. Nevertheless, moving to Lorca in Spain, Kevin Martin, and because he's very young, 19 years old, we may see him in a Gold Cup down the road. That's all for left midfielders. So 3 candidates there, but just one player coded as a right midfielder, and that's Rolando Abreu. And Rolando Abreu is a likely candidate for us. He has been with Cuba since 2018, has 24 caps but no goals, and he is 31 years old. So Rolando Abreu plays for Santiago de Cuba, and he was part of the 2019 Gold Cup, started game 1, but actually lost his starting position there, so just came in for one other game as a substitute. And he started 1 of their 9 games since the start of 2022, and was subbed in for 1 and on the bench for 7 others. So even though he doesn't look like a starter, he seems to be always called up. So always called up over the last 9 games. Rolando Abreu. Moving on to left wingers, we have 3 candidates. The first is at the definite level, and that's William Pozo Venta. William Pozo Venta, with Cuba since 2021, and he has 13 caps and is 25 years old, and he plays in Finland since 2023, and he was with a couple of teams in Norway prior to that. He has not been involved in any tournaments, of course, since he joined in 2021. Started 7 of their 9 games since the start of 2022, subbed in for 1 and on the bench for 1 other. So a definite candidate for us, William Pozo Venta. And also a likely candidate for left wing is Yaniel Matos. So, or I'm not sure how to pronounce it, could be Yasniel. Yasniel Matos or Yaniel Matos, has been with Cuba since 2021 and has 13 caps and 1 goal, but is just 21 years old. And he plays in Guatemala also since 2021, where he moved from his team in Cuba. And he got a goal in World Cup no, he got a goal in Gold Cup qualifying there in their 1-0 win over Guadeloupe, and started the last 2 of their 9 games since the beginning of 2022. But he was subbed in for 5 and on the bench for 1. So just 1 game that he wasn't called up for. That's Yaniel Matos. And the player I was wondering about in terms of his status with Cuba is Onel Hernandez, because we saw him playing in the English Premier League. Unfortunately, we have him as seemingly off the squad. So he did play for Cuba since 2021, and he got 8 caps and 3 goals. So he is a scorer. He's 30 years old, and he plays for Norwich in England. But he's been loaned out to Birmingham and Middlesbrough during his time there, and was actually moved from Norwich in 2018 from Eintracht Braunschweig in Germany. So a bit of a world traveler there. He seems to have moved to Germany as a young boy, actually, and he got his first appearance in March 2021, but hasn't appeared for the team since June of 2022. So Onel Hernandez would be a great addition to the team, but for the time being, it looks like he's off the team, and we'll have to wait until part 2 to see if he plays for them. We have no players coded as right wingers, but we do have 2 players coded as general midfielders. One of them is at the possible but unlikely level, and the other is at the seemingly off the squad level. Sorry, I'm organizing the graphics here. So the one who seems to be off the squad is Jasael Herrera, and he's brand new to Cuba, and he plays for Cienfuegos in Cuba, and is just 20 years old, so making his way into the team. He actually has no caps for the national team, but he did appear on the bench in March 2022 and had been on the bench for their last 2 remaining games there. So maybe a bit higher than possible but unlikely, because when they come in at the very end, it's hard to know, but it kind of raises their chances. So I'm going to move him up to the possible level. The other one at the seemingly off the squad level is Asmel Nunez. So Asmel Nunez is has been with Cuba since 2021 with 6 caps. He's not young, actually. He is 31 years old and is still and is playing in Cuba for Santiago de Cuba. And he got his first appearance in March 2021, but last appeared for the national team in June 2022. So just like Onel Hernandez there. Okay, we move on to the forward line. We begin with attacking midfielders, and we begin with a definite candidate in Dayron Reyes. So Dayron Reyes, been with the team since 2021, and he is 19 years old, but he has 14 caps and 1 goal already, and he plays for Inter Miami's B team in the USA. He started 8 of their 9 games since the start of 2022 and subbed in for 1 other. However, he is out with a ruptured ligament injury, and that's very recent, from the beginning of May, and it has an unknown return date. So that would be a big loss for Cuba, and to be honest, that injury doesn't look like something he'll get over in time for the Cup. But we will update. We will update in June as to how that's coming along. We also have a likely candidate in Arakel Hernandez. Arakel Hernandez has been with Cuba since 2012, so a real veteran for the team. He's 29 years old, and he has 37 caps and 8 goals. And he was playing, again, a bit of a confusing history in terms of the immigration policy. He is with Mixco in Guatemala right now, and was with a team in Dominican Republic from 2019 to 2022. He was with 2 teams in Cuba before that, but from 2017 to 18, he was with Independiente in Panama. So again, not really sure what the rules are. Aracal Hernandez was part of the Gold Cup in 2015. At least he was on the roster, but he was denied entry into the country stemming from a visa issue, at least for game 1. So they did have problems getting into the USA there. For the Gold Cup in 2019, there were no such problems. He started and finished all the games, and he scored 4 of their 11 goals in qualifying for this cup, and he started 4 of their 9 games since the start of 2022, subbing in for 1 and on the bench for 2, but not selected for 2 matches. However, those were the last 2 matches that they've played, so a bit of a concern. Nevertheless, he's such a veteran that we think that they will need him, so we consider him likely, and that'll probably be that much more the case with Dairon Reyes injured and with no other candidates coded as attacking midfielders. However, we do have one coded as a secondary striker, and that is Christian Flores. And Christian Flores seems a possible candidate to us. New to Cuba since 2022, and he's 24 years old. And we move on to the forwards, where we have actually 2 definite candidates here. The first is Mikel Reyes. Mikel Reyes has been with Cuba since 2012, so a long-term member of the squad at 30 years old. He has 39 caps and 8 goals, and he plays for Jalapa in Guatemala. He's played in Dominican Republic, Honduras, and Mexico also. In the 2015 Gold Cup, he had visa problems, so didn't appear in game 1. But returned to a starting position. And perhaps the same thing in 2019. I just have that he didn't appear in game 1, but gained a starting position for games 2 and 3 there. So that kind of indicative of some of the troubles that Cuba has at the Gold Cup. Since the start of 2022, he has started 5 of their games and was subbed in for 4 others. So our definite doesn't necessarily mean he'll be a starter here, just a definite candidate to make the Gold Cup squad, we think. And the other definite candidate is Luis Paradella, and perhaps we should have put him first. You'll see why in a second, but he's been with the team since 2018, and he has 30 caps and also 8 goals, just like Mikel Reyes, 8 goals. And he is 26 years old, and he plays for Saprissa in Costa Rica. Now, a bit of confusion about Cuba's migration or immigration policy, because he left his team Cuba in 2018. Actually, the beginning of 2019, he joined a team in Guatemala, and nevertheless, that was in January, and he played in the Gold Cup in June of 2019. So we saw one player earlier who defected to America, was not allowed to play, and then came back to play. So it's all very confusing. Anyway, Luis Paradella started all 9 of their games since the start of 2022. So we consider him a definite candidate. As I said, he should be above Mikel Reyes there. We also have a possible candidate in Daniel Diaz. So Daniel Diaz has been with Cuba since 2022, and he is just 20 years old with 2 caps, and he plays for San Carlos in Costa Rica, having moved from Cuba in 2021. He got his first cap in November of 2022 and didn't start any of their remaining 3 games there, but he was subbed in for 2 and on the bench for the other. So coming into the picture quite late and we have Daniel Diaz as a possible candidate. And finally, we deal with a candidate who seems to be off the squad, Marcel Hernandez. So Marcel Hernandez played with the team from 2010 and has 23 caps and 8 goals, and plays for Cartagena in Costa Rica. He's been with other teams in Costa Rica and Dominican Republic, all over the place really, but in the Caribbean. And interestingly, he came back to the team in 2022 after a more than 9-year absence. That's one of the longest I've seen, because you know, careers usually don't last a lot more than that. And he actually announced his retirement after the 2013 Gold Cup. I think he's the only player so far that we've seen taking part in the 2011 Gold Cup, where he started all 3 games, announced his retirement from international play after the 2013 Gold Cup. And lo and behold, he returns after a more than 9-year absence in March 2022 to start the first of the remaining 9 games, the first 2 actually, but then not selected after that, not even listed for the 7 others. So it doesn't look like he is back in the picture. We have him as seemingly off the squad, but kind of a fun story to end part 1 of the media cast on. And we will come back in part 2 in a couple of weeks. And we will have the preliminary and final rosters by then, so we can go over the list again and tell you who made it. It's June, and welcome back to part 2. If you're coming from part 1, welcome anew if you're coming just in for the short version. So I'll just orient you by telling you what we did in part 1. So we created a list of possible candidates for the team. That's mostly players who, mostly based on players who have played for the team since 2022. And we categorized them first by their position to organize the discussion, and then by their likelihood of making the team. So you're going to see that list as we go through it once again in part 2 and tell you who made the team, who made the preliminary squad, and who made or who didn't even make the preliminary squad. So we have a 33-man preliminary squad for Cuba, and in part 1 we had a lot of confusion about what rules there are for Cubans leaving the country, or playing in the country, or not playing in the country, or defecting. So I want to correct one mistake I made. We did say during the 2015 and 2019, and actually dating back to well before that, players defecting from the team coming over. And then we said there was no problem in 2021 because they weren't part of the Cup. Well, the reason they weren't part of the Cup was part of the problem. For some reason, they made them play a playoff game in the United States. And I'm not sure why they had to play that game in the United States when they have such problems getting visas and stuff. So they were unable to make it to that game due to visa problems and also COVID problems. So they actually did struggle also in 2021. Things do seem a bit more settled this time in terms of I haven't heard of any problems or any expected problems for Cuba. So hopefully they can bring their best team to the Cup and have no problem entering the country. And if that's the case, then we will see these players. Let's move on to talk about the squad and candidates. So we began by saying Raul Menderos was the manager in their last tournament in 2019, and Pablo Sanchez took over after that. So no problems there. It seems like Pablo Sanchez will be leading them through the Cup, unlike Mexico, whose manager was fired between our parts 1 and 2. Pablo Sanchez leading the way. Okay, for goalkeepers, we had a definite candidate in Sandy Sanchez and 2 likely candidates. as well as one possible but unlikely. So it all seemed fairly well laid out, and indeed it was, because our three candidates there, Sandy Sanchez, and the two likely candidates, Nelson Johnson and Reiko Arozarena, did make the final squad. We decided to put Reiko Arozarena slightly ahead of Nelson Johnson there, but really we're not kind of get into predicting starters here, but we did think that Arozarena was slightly more likely than Nelson Johnson. Nevertheless, both of them made it. However, Elior Pozo, our possible but unlikely candidate, not even selected for the preliminary squad. On to defense and central midfielders, we had a definite candidate in Carlos Vasquez, often called Cavafe, and he did make the squad, the final squad, as did our likely candidate, Yosel Piedra. We had three possible candidates for the making the cup, and all three of them made it. So Eduardo Hernandez, Modesto Mendez, and Mario Penalver all selected for the final squad there. And possible, but not possible, but unlikely, we have a new candidate. So not just those five, but one player added to the mix there, and that is Romario Torres. And because we didn't introduce him in the first part of the podcast, we'll introduce him here. So he is just 18 years old and plays for Nacional in Uruguay, so pretty interesting case here. He moved from Artemisa to Nacional in 2023, and he was new to the squad. He was subbed in for one of the two warm-up games immediately before the tournament, and he was on the bench for the other. So a latecomer to the squad, and so one of the surprises there. Okay, at left back, we had a definite candidate in Dario Moreon, and he did make the final squad, as did the possible candidate, Jorge Luis Corrales, making the final squad there. At the right back position, though, we had a likely candidate who did not make the squad. So Grable Palmer only selected for the preliminary squad there. And we also had one general defender in Osniel Ramos, and he did not make the preliminary squad. Moving on to midfield, a definite candidate in Carol Espino, but probably the biggest surprise here, as he was not selected even for the preliminary squad, despite starting 8 of their 9 games since the start of 2022, as we talked about in the first part of the podcast. We kind of justified why we placed them where we did, and so this really comes as a surprise. That is Carol Espino. But we did have a possible candidate in Nasser Sando, and Nasser Sando did make the squad. But David Inserti, who we thought was seemingly off the squad, proves to be so by not being selected even for the preliminary squad. Moving on to central midfielders. That's a singular because they only had one, and it was at I think I initially had him as a likely candidate, and during part 1 we moved him down to possible. It's Denilson Milanes, but maybe we should have left him as a likely candidate because he did make the squad. Denilson Milanes, not a surprise really, because there's only one candidate or one player coded as a central midfielder. We have a couple of left midfielders, though, and Unia Perez we considered a definite candidate, and he made the squad. And Roberni Caballero at the possible level also made the squad. We had Kevin Martin as possible but unlikely. He did make the preliminary squad, but not the final cut to the Gold Cup squad. Among right midfielders, we had a likely candidate in Rolando Abreu, but he was only named to the preliminary squad there. And that's all we had for right midfielders. For left wingers, we had William Pozo Venta as a definite candidate, and he made the squad. And Yasniel Matos, the likely candidate, also made the squad. We were really curious about Onel Hernandez, but in fact, the mystery deepens because we had him seemingly off the squad. He last appeared for the team in June 2022. So we thought he was gone, and he's not completely gone. He was named to the preliminary squad. So we're not sure how that leaves him in relation to Cuba, whether he's kind of on the team or off the team. But anyway, he's not on the World Cup, on the Gold Cup squad here. For general midfielders, we had a possible candidate. We moved him up from possible but unlikely to possible, and it was Jasael Herrera, and we were wise in moving him up because he did make the final squad, Jasael Herrera. However, the player who seemed to be off the squad, Asmel Nunez, not selected even for the preliminary squad. For forwards, we began with Dayron Reyes. Dayron Reyes was a definite candidate. However, he was coded as or flagged as an injury, and it seems that injury has prevented him from even being named to the preliminary squad. So that is unfortunate for Cuba. The other candidate we had for attacking midfielder was Arikel Hernandez, and he does make the final squad, as we thought he was likely to do. Okay, so we'll summarize the injuries later. We also had an injury doubt for secondary striker Christian Flores, and it proves that his injury is keeping him off the squad too. So that's two attacking players that they miss. Christian Flores not named even to the preliminary squad. And finally, the forwards, we have Mikel Reyes as a definite candidate and Luis Paradella as an even more definite candidate. And both of those did make the final squad. We had Daniel Diaz as a possible candidate. He also made the final squad. And then we finished with the interesting case of Marcel Hernandez, who came back from a nine-year absence to play a couple of games. But that did prove to be short-lived, as he did not make even the preliminary squad. But we do have one new candidate here, and that is Alder Ruiz. So Alder Ruiz, we didn't talk about in the first part of the podcast because he wasn't on our radar. That podcast was in May, and he started both of their warm-up games immediately before the tournament in June. So he kind of came in there right at the end. He has then 2 caps, and he interestingly plays for Europa FC in Gibraltar, having played with another team in Gibraltar, Lynx FC, and prior to that in Spain. So pretty interesting club affiliation there. But Alder Ruiz making it at the last minute there to the cup. Okay, well, we're going to finish just by summarizing some of this information, beginning with notable non-selections, and we have a few. We have right back Grable Palmer, who we thought was a likely candidate, and he just made the preliminary squad. We have Carral Espino. We thought was a definite candidate, and he was not even selected for the preliminary squad. Rolando Abreu, another likely candidate, only made it to the preliminary squad. And Well, a couple of others, but they are injuries rather than non-selection. So we'll move on to surprise inclusions. We have a couple, Jasael Herrera. We considered him, initially we considered him possible but unlikely, and then we moved him up to possible. So not as much as a surprise as all that. We kind of saved ourselves there in part one. But the real mystery is Onel Hernandez and what role he plays for Cuba. Seemingly off the squad, but then named to the preliminary squad. Difficult to know what's going on. It could be as simple as they just hope that he would change his mind and come on over. So you have to be named on the preliminary squad to make the final squad. So it could be that they just put his name on the list in hopes that he would come. But I'm not sure. Okay, new players. We had two of them. First one was Romario Torres. Making the squad, so this also acts as a bit of a surprise. Coming in right at the end there, playing for Nacional in Uruguay, and I believe one of their two warm-up games was against Uruguay. And the other one, Alder Ruiz, again added just before the tournament there, and he plays in Gibraltar. For other new players, we had 6 names that were not on our radar. We didn't have them in the soccer files, so now we add them to the soccer files, but they only made the preliminary squad, and we don't see a lot of sense in going over those names here. But if they come into the picture more in the future, they are already on our radar. And finally, we finish with injuries, so we mentioned them. Dayron Reyes dropped from the squad due to injury. They knew about that apparently before they made the preliminary squad. He got his injury in the middle of May, so it was somewhat late and an unknown return date. It seemed pretty serious with a ruptured cruciate ligament injury, so we didn't think he would recover in time to make it to the Cup. That is too bad. And then the other one, also an attacker, Christian Flores, same thing, cruciate ligament injury. He suffered his in early February 2023 and is not expected back until October 2023. So that gives you kind of the range of that cruciate ligament injury. I thought it was 9 months to a year, and it looks like about 9 months here too. That would be a fairly quick recovery if Christian Flores is back for his Costa Rican team by October. Anyway, certainly they're out of the question for the Gold Cup here. And that brings us to the end